recording? Okay, cool. Hello guys and welcome back to Itchy Brains. Yep, that's right, back with another episode. Let's address the elephant in the room right off the bat. Today, the day I'm recording the podcast is November 2nd. Tomorrow is election day. Basically, we're going to know who's going to be our next president, America's next president. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. As far as I would like to keep podcasts away from politics, I feel like this is a thing that I need to address because it feels like everything is, the tension here is so breathtaking. I feel like everybody in, especially in downtown DC and like the main places like that, they're just holding their breath on what's going to happen. We're pretty sure that election is going to take place on November 3rd. But after that, we don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. Obviously, we are going to find out like who's going to be the next president. But after that, is there going to be any rioting? Anything else? Like nothing is certain. Yeah, the tensions are high. The stakes are high. Whew, it's been interesting. Like the politics ride is very interesting to follow. But then certainly it corrupts your brain. That's why I just like to stay away from politics. So yeah, fingers crossed. Hopefully whatever happens for the best for this country and for every other country that's been watching. So this week, or I guess it was last week, I got to celebrate Dasai, which was really fun. I think this year has been the most funnest year since I've been to America because I got to visit a lot of households and I got to collect some decent amount of money from those households. People who don't know about Dasai, I guess the main part of it for us, for especially young kids, teenagers, and everybody who is participating, I guess old people care less about the money, but for us, it's the money. So basically you go to a household and then I guess they invite you first and then you go there and then they will send you back with money in an envelope. That's how it works. And that's what I get excited for every year. Also, it's a cool way to socialize with people that you haven't socialized with, you haven't connected with for the whole year. It's like Christmas for us. My brother, he got to celebrate Halloween, which was 2 or 3 days ago, and the guy, bro, the guy was able to collect like a bag full of candy, and I was like, what are you going to do with all these candies? And he was like, just eat the ones that I like and then to throw away the ones that I don't. And I was like, yeah, fair enough. But it was a group of like 5 or 6 kids that went to townhouses that are nearby. With one of my elder relatives, we were just talking about girls and stuff, and then we were just watching them do their thing, basically wearing costumes and then knocking on each door and then just like receiving candy. Yeah, it's a fun festival. I can see the correlation between Dasai and Halloween in terms of like we basically receive money and then they receive chocolates. See, I'm not sure if I would ever choose Halloween over Dasai. Like I feel like money is more fun than candy. But I can get like for little kids, like money matters it's like very low on their list. And then candy is going to be at the top of the list. Makes sense. I didn't go, just not into the spirit of Halloween. I played poker. In Dasai and I lost some money. And then I played poker in Halloween with my brother and I won all of his money. Bing, bing. That's how poker works, baby. Yeah, I need to teach some lessons to my little brother before he grows up, like losing money in poker and that kind of thing. I feel very good doing that. He lost. He was running on a bad luck. I was running on a good luck. That's it. All right, so today's episode is going to be different in a sense that there are going to be instructions to follow, or at least, I guess, in other words, if you want to get the most benefit out of this episode, there are going to be some protocols that you would have to follow. So I'm going to be sharing like a good amount of podcasts. I guess there are 10 for this episode, and then I'll be releasing a part 2 with another 10 podcast recommendations that I would like for you guys to check out. These are the podcasts, like I've been a fan of the podcasting world ever since I discovered it, and I just love this fucking medium. I wish I would have found this earlier. So the way this is going to work is, I guess, the audio itself is going to be a commentary on what's going to be in the show notes. In the show notes, I'm going to leave a link to the specific podcast that I mentioned in order so that you guys can have it easier on finding the specific podcast that I talk about. Cherry pick the ones that you find interesting, and then disregard the ones that you don't find interesting. Don't bother the ones that you don't find interesting. If you are undecided on whether or not you want to listen to the episode or you just want to pass, I would say give it a listen. Also, I would like to recommend that you guys download Google Podcast so that you can have it easier. I feel like Google Podcast has been my go-to app for listening to podcasts or discovering podcasts. Google Podcast and YouTube. Most of the audios are not going to be found on YouTube. It's going to be in the app itself. Most of the podcasts that I listen to don't have a video format, so I highly recommend downloading Google Podcast so that it can be easier for you guys to subscribe or to put into queue some of the episodes that I'm going to mention. I guess that's a way for reaping the most benefits out of this episode. I'm fucking excited for you guys to check out these podcasts that I'm going to mention. I feel like they're like such great podcasts. So this is the first episode, and in the first episode, I'm going to mention the names of the podcasts that are going to be wide appealing to a lot of audience. In the second one, it's going to be very niche down upon what I have liked over the months that I've discovered podcasts. Has it been a year since I've discovered this medium? I don't know, man. I think it was in 2019. Yeah, it was, or maybe in 2020. I'm not sure. I think it's been very close to a year. I don't know if I've been over a year or behind a year. So yeah, download Google Podcast and then go to the link in the description of any podcast that you find interesting, and then subscribe to them. And in the episodes that I'm going to mention, you can find those episodes and then put them in queue so that you can listen to those episodes, those fantastic episodes, right after this podcast is over. Obviously, listen to the complete podcast first. So let's go into the reason first why I decided to publish the episode. I appreciate it when people put out like a list of songs that they enjoy, like Anthony Fantano does with his YouTube channel. List of album that he enjoys, and then I get to cherry pick the ones that I find interesting, or list of books people enjoy reading, or list of books people recommend. I find those videos to be absolutely helpful, because I can then find my own little interest and then dive into the book that I would like to enjoy, or I would like to check out, or that has sparked an interest in me. Same thing with albums, same thing with movies. I'm a heavy depender on movies that other people recommend. One rule that I've created for myself in terms of movies is that if someone recommends it, that's not going to be enough for me to check out that movie. I feel like there has to be someone else mentioning the same movie or doubling down on the same movie by complete randomness, or by sheer choice. Like at least 2 or 3 people has to tell me about the same movie for me to check it out, because there are so many movies, so many TV series that every person mentions. I feel like if there is an intersection with many people, that show is going to be way better than one person recommending me like 5 or 6 movies. So that's the one little rule that I've created for movies, also for books. But I have no such rule for podcasts, because I feel like podcasts don't get recommended enough, which they should be, at least for me. Alright, so that's the reason why I decided to make this episode for the past year. Let's just call it a year. For the past year, I've been listening to loads and loads of podcasts. Obviously, like, I lived pretty far away, so in terms of commute, it was like a 4-hour drive. So, music wasn't enough. Like music, I would get very bored of music very soon. So I had to find any other medium to basically keep my drive short, keep my drive more interesting and not let me fall asleep in the steering wheel. And I've been fortunate enough to have listened to like a bunch of different podcast episodes ranging from film to educational to like binge worthy to sex to comedy, like all these different genres of podcasts. And then in this episode I've compiled 10 of them that I appreciate for existing, for I just love them so much. And they're in no particular order. I'm not counting them down. They're in as random as they can be. No, actually I've categorized them in terms of their genre, but not in terms of like numbers. I didn't want to do that. So let's get into it. So the first podcast that I have on the list that I think is quite popular in the podcasting world is this podcast called Reply All. If you have never heard of Reply All, it's a show about the internet, and these people, they dive deep into each topic. One of the examples that I can give you, if you have never heard of Reply All, I would like you to start from this episode called Long Distance. It's a 3-part episode, but I'm telling you, once you click on the first one, you're going to binge listen to all 3 of them. It's about a scammer giving call to one of the hosts of the podcast, and it goes so far that the host decide to go to India to find out about who the scammer is and to meet him in person. And he does. That's how deep this episode goes. It's an absolutely fantastic way to go about storytelling and to keep the audience guessing all the time. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Again, you can subscribe right now, or you can just click on the episode that I've linked in the show notes. Cool. Second episode here on the list is called Radiolab. Radiolab is very similar to Reply All. If Reply All is about the internet, Radiolab is going to be about consciousness, basically about consciousness and a lot of science. I guess the starting episode would be, I highly recommend checking out Space, which I will leave a link in the show notes. I think I forgot to mention this. The way like the show notes is going to work is that I would like for you guys to come back to the description again and again. If you think you have missed out on anything, or if you feel like you need to get some more recommendations, feel free to come back again and again to the description and then like checking out the podcast that I mentioned here as much as you like. All right, so Radiolab is the second one. You guys can start with Space. It's a very interesting storytelling in terms of like how big space is and what are the things we still don't know about space. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's like the only astrophysicist that I know, is on the podcast as well for a small segment. And then he shares his thought as well. It's a wonderful episode. All right, next we get into like the big players of the podcast world. So if you look back at the history of podcasting, basically they were started by like small players, small independent people who couldn't get their own radio show. So they basically, a bunch of nerds who basically found this medium of just talking with people through like small recording studio and very low budgeting stuff. Obviously nowadays it's very easier, far more easier. But then it's always the case that the big players are going to invade the space and then you'll hear from the big players. NPR. This is basically the giant of the podcasting world. They have fantastic way of telling each fucking stories. Very compelling. And I feel like once you listen to their way of storytelling, they're so high budget, like very well produced. Obviously the sound quality is off the roof. I feel like they are the players who are like doing it the best in terms of quality and like the production value. And NPR is one company that has like loads and loads of different podcasts. So they have one podcast for news, another podcast for money, another podcast for like college students and those kind of stuff. So they have different segments. It's a one big news company basically. And I feel like once someone gets familiar with podcasting world, like NPR is one of those podcasts where one is very likely to bump into. So the first NPF podcast that I would like to mention that I absolutely love is called Invisibilia. Invisibilia is about the invisible forces that shape our day-to-day life. The episode that I found the most compelling was this episode called Emotions. Like, emotion is such a big topic, but the way these people have been able to fit it into, like, I guess it was 2 parts, was just done so beautifully. When you listen to the episode, it almost feels like a movie playing in your head, just the way the episode is narrated. And there is also an underlying big picture, big question that they put out at the end of each episode that just makes you want to think. So again, the episode that I would recommend is called Emotions. Highly recommend. Next up on the list is Life Kit by NPR. Life Kit is like solemnly focused on college and high school kids. Life Kit is also, they don't take a whole lot of storytelling time. They basically like tips on, how to cope with COVID-19. How do you manage your budget? How do you finance your money? Questions like what to eat if you are running on a budget, what to buy, how to consume food in terms of nutrition value, and all those kind of like small questions. Or it could be about how do you vote through mail if there is someone who has never voted before. And this year, like as some of you might know, we're voting through mail, not through in person. So yeah, they have a topic about that as well. Like there is a whole list of episodes that are just designed for, like I said, for college students or even graduates, like very small tips that are very helpful in terms of today, in order to survive and in order to manage yourself better. Yeah, it's a whole world of well management. Next on the list, we're now moving away from NPR and we are going into ISIS. Jesus Christ. We're going into ISIS. The name of the podcast is Caliphate. This is, I think, by far the most bingeable mini podcast series that I've listened to. It's on ISIS, basically a New York reporter. I forgot her name. She's a journalist, and then she describes her relation to ISIS. We're terrified of these ISIS group, but exactly what are they and what is their mission? How did they come about? Like all these questions and a very in-depth analysis of where they've been and how they function, how they manage their society, and how they're managing to do things that they've been able to get away with, like all these stuff. I feel like it is highly bingeable, and it is a well worth podcast that you should listen to. There are like 10 to 12 episodes or something like that. I highly recommend Caliphate by New York Times. Let's move into film category. Yeah, I was struggling with whether to put film category in the niche one that I like to enjoy or to put it in a widely appealing. I ended up putting it in widely appealing because everybody to a degree likes film, so why not? The first up on the list is Show Me the Meaning, which is a podcast hosted by Jared from Wisecrack. There are these 3 dudes who talk about movies. I feel like the best way to describe Show Me the Meaning is like extra commentary on the movie that you have already watched. It's like watching the extra commentary on a football game that you have already seen, or a soccer game, or a basketball game. I am like, if you guys have watched the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, it basically left me with like a lot of confusion. There were a lot of unanswered questions that I wanted to look up for, and this was the best place for me to check them out. Like they have a loads selection of movies that they talk about. They basically give us the meaning behind each movie, or say they try the best. I'm waiting for Tenet because I still feel like I've watched the movie, but then I've understood very little about like the whole full picture of what the movie was about. So I'm waiting on that. Their commentary helps me a lot on understanding how a movie works and what the movie was trying to get to. Show Me the Meaning, link in the show notes. All right, the next podcast that I have was, I guess, one of the first podcasts that I remember listening to. So the Chernobyl podcast is an extra commentary on the Chernobyl miniseries that's on HBO. If you guys have not seen that miniseries, I highly recommend. It's a fantastic piece of factual storytelling of what happened in the nuclear disaster of the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl. The podcast is similar to Show Me the Meaning in terms of going into deep analysis of what the series was about. But it is different in terms that the director himself is speaking and giving how each episode was made, how they went about telling the truth, how they went about telling the story on each episode. If I'm not wrong, I feel like you can say, if you have watched the first episode of the Chernobyl miniseries, I guess you can dive into the first episode of the Chernobyl podcast. I don't think they spoil anything in the first episode of the podcast. I think it aligns with where the episode has started and where the episode has ended. And yeah, I don't think they spoil what happens next in each episode. It goes very in a parallel fashion. I think it's a wonderful take. I've never heard any other podcast like this before. Any other director coming on a podcast and then talking about, how they went about choosing things that they chose. And also, it's a deeper dive into the world of Chernobyl itself, of the power plant itself, of the characters themselves, Obviously, these are real-life people and real-life characters, and what was real and what was not. Interesting podcast. Again, links in the show notes, baby. Next up, we have history. I don't listen to a whole lot of history. I've given this podcast a listen, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I still have a lot of episodes to listen to. So one of the most heard things about the Itchy Brains podcast that I've heard is the podcast being too long. If you think so, if you feel so, you can check out Hardcore History. It is a deep discussion about history and what happened. I guess this is the number one podcast in terms of history. And Dan Carlin, he does a wonderful job of describing the world that we are in. One of the episodes that I started from was the history of Genghis Khan and the Chinese emperor, who basically slaughtered all the other emperors and was basically the biggest ruler history has ever seen. And it is such a deep dive into that world. This is the shit in terms of history. This makes history so much more interesting. I've not been a fan of history, but if anything, I feel like Hardcore History is the closest I can get to making it as interesting as possible for me. Each episode is, I think, 3 to 5 hours long. Some of them also run for 6 hours. And it is such loads and loads of information, and it is packed with so much history in it. In terms of how to get started with this podcast is say if you say Genghis Khan, if you say that I want to know more about Genghis Khan, where do I get started from? He has a separate podcast dedicated for Genghis Khan. He has a separate podcast dedicated for other rulers. I can't even think a name. Julius Caesar, all these other leaders. He has a separate podcast for them and a separate podcast for Genghis Khan. And each mini podcast, if you will, runs for about 7 to 8 episodes, each of them being 3 to 5 hours. It's insane. But then if you're interested, it's so much fun. All right, moving away from history, we go to educational. And these are the podcasts that I find myself coming back for more and more. The first one that is high up my list is by the man himself, Shane Paris, our CIA agent, secret CIA agent, who hosts this wonderful podcast called The Knowledge Project. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Timeless conversations with some of the best thinkers in the world. This is the kind of podcast that I personally like to take notes to, because there are like so much information packed in them, like real life wisdom, real life example. For you guys to get started with, I would recommend this recent episode that was released with Liza. It's titled Balancing the Brain Budget, and it is a wonderful discussion on how we produce emotions. I'm also currently reading Liza's book. It's titled How Emotions Are Made. It's a little thick book, so I'm taking my time with it. But yeah, it's a fun dive into the world of emotions, how they are created, and a different approach from a person who has worked so long in that field. I believe Lisa is a scientist. That's the episode you guys can get started with. If you like that, there are like loads more in his website. Shane himself has also written a book that we discussed on this podcast. It was called Great Mental Models, if you guys remember that. Yeah, I really like this the podcast, the blog. I really appreciate the man putting out the work. The next up, we have the big man, big brain himself, Mr. Tim Ferriss. I feel like he's the giant propagation of productivity. I mean, what can I say? He's the beast in terms of productivity and like helpful tips that we can follow in order to improve our lives. There are some crossovers with the people that Shane talks with. Tim also has a blog post. He's a very successful writer. I'm currently reading his 2 books, The 4-Hour Workweek, Tools of Titans, brilliant books. I guess if you guys want to get started with the Tim Ferriss show, he has recently published an episode with the historian himself, Yuval Noah Harari. I've been following Harari for a while, especially after reading his widely popular book, Sapiens. I like his thesis a lot that, we humans are separate from animals because we are able to tell stories and animals aren't able to do that. Like, I find that fascinating. And I wanted to know more. And Tim did a discussion for that. I'll leave a link in the show notes. After checking out that episode, you can also check out this episode with Hugh Jackman. Hugh Jackman is a brilliant actor who has played in Prestige, The Greatest Showman, X-Men, the whole franchise, the man himself. He recently came on the show, and one of the things that I remember Jackman telling was that he has learned more about the world from the Tim Ferriss show than from any other medium. And I was like, oh wow. So these big celebrities listen to the same podcast that I listen to, and they are getting like the same information that I'm getting. And I was like, wonderful. Yeah, slowly as Tim Ferriss is growing his brand, he's able to talk with celebrities, people, and it's been fun recently bringing the big people into the game. I think he also did a discussion with Sia, who, covers her face every time she sings with songs like Chandelier, what else? Cheap Thrills. Yeah, he did a talk with her as well. And it was like really interesting for me because I don't get to hear from Sia a whole lot in any other medium. So that was fun. Let's get into philosophy. I have one recommendation for philosophy. I think it is a brilliant discussion on current philosophers there are. And they're like, the title speaks for itself, Philosophy Bites. It's like small bite packages of philosophy that you can listen to in the morning and then go on with the day. I think they're like 20 to 22 minutes episode each. And there are like loads and loads of episodes that you can choose from. I would recommend starting from an episode they did on forgiveness. They bring on, so there are 2 hosts, Nigel Warburton, and I forgot the name of the other one. And they bring on guests, one specific guest for one specific topic. And they did a podcast on forgiveness. And I thought that was really brilliant. Why do we have such a hard time forgiving other people for the mistakes they have done, especially if the mistakes have caused us like some greater harm? Even if the mistake was done maybe like 3 years ago, why do we still bear that anger in us? And why we're still unable to forgive that person for the mistake that they've done. Philosophy Bites has been my philosophy podcast, my go-to philosophy podcast for a long. I am experimenting with other podcasts, but as for now, I would recommend checking out Philosophy Bites and starting with the episode on forgiveness. One of the hosts is also an author. His name is Nigel Warrington, and I was able to finish his book on a little history of philosophy. I thought that was a neat little package to share, like all the philosophers in like a small book. It's like 1 or 2 pages for each philosopher, and he goes from Plato to Darwin to Nietzsche to Carl Jung to Kant. The book is brilliant. If you guys have time to check out the book as well, I'll leave a link in the show notes. And that, I feel like with, how many recommendations was it? It was like 10 recommendations. If you guys are not sure which ones to listen to and which ones not to listen to, I would still recommend like subscribing to each one of these podcasts that I mentioned. Again, link in the show notes, that I mentioned, and then just subscribe to them. And then later on, when you realize that you are not finding or you are not listening to one particular podcast, just unsubscribe from them. But at least for now, just like subscribe to them so that they can show up on your feed, and then you can have, you can just click on one and then see whether you like the taste of the podcast. Once again, these are the podcasts that have worked for me, or the reason why I find the podcasting world so interesting and so knowledgeable, if you will. Also, if you guys have not already downloaded Google Podcasts, I think the description, the show notes are going to be better displayed in Google Podcasts than on Anchor. So that's another reason to download Google Podcasts. For some of the podcasts that I talked about here today, I also mentioned like which episodes to get started with. One way to approach that would be to like just put like each episode in queue. I'll just leave like a specific episode for one specific podcast in the show description, in the show notes, so that you can click on it and then just like add it to your queue, and then under the description, add it to your queue, so that you can keep on listening if you like, or you can just like click on one podcast and then just scroll through, just look at the titles, look at the thumbnails if there is any, and then just see the one that you find interesting. That's it for today. I hope you guys find this material interesting. If you guys were able to experiment with any of these episodes or any of these podcasts that I love so much, you can tell me about them on my Instagram. You can text me, say hi to me, whatever. If you like the episode, you can talk about that. If you didn't like the episode, you can tell me about that as well. My Instagram is @project33. Come by, say hello, tell me whether you like the podcast that I mentioned just now. All right, I'll see you on the other side of the election. Hopefully by then we'll know who has won. All right, that's it. Take care. Bye.